can you actually buy a business with no money? Well, yes, but there's a big difference between someone who can buy a business with no money and someone who actually has no money to buy a business. In this video, I brought on David Barnett, who has helped multiple people buy businesses with no money. He's also saved people from blowing their life savings on businesses that were bad deals. Now, David is the man when it comes to buying businesses, and he's going to share 3 different ways that you can buy a business without any of your own cash. And also, stick around for option number 3, because in this video, he's going to teach us how you can put yourself around the right people to be able to buy a business, even if you are financially broke.
There's a lot of things that people will believe when you hear the phrase buy a business with no money, and we're gonna peel back that onion a little bit and kind of look at it from some different angles. But the first thing I want to define before we get started is what exactly a business is, because sometimes there's a little bit of confusion. So what I define a business as is a system where people, capital, operate together in a place to produce a cash flow. And that place could be a website, right? So even an online business has these same things. People are doing things. You've got some kind of capital, websites you've invested in, inventory perhaps, and you've got this place, even if it's a website, where this business activity is occurring. And importantly, it's a positive cash flow. So we're not talking today about money-losing businesses, distressed assets, or a closed business where there's just some machinery maybe that someone might buy. Really, we're talking about a going concern business which is making money for its owner, and a buyer that comes along and makes a deal to become the owner of that business without using any of their own money. Okay, so you with me here so far?
Yeah, a business is a system that provides an income stream or a net profit, not just. Yeah. It's not just let's just have a place that we do things. If it's a business, it can go backwards, but we're talking about businesses actually providing a profit, right? We don't want to just go away and invest our money into something that's like going to be a tax write-off or whatever, right? We're talking about a positive cash flow business.
Right. And the reason why I define it this way is because you could have somebody whose ice cream shop has closed down because the owner has passed on, and someone comes along to an auction and buys everything at 20 cents on the dollar using their credit card and opens up the shop again the next day. And you could say they bought a business using no money, but really they didn't. They bought a bunch of stuff at an auction.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
So this is the distinction I want to create.
Yeah, cool. And it's the same with people that are buying a startup. Is they're buying something that is trying to work. They're getting it for however much, half of what the person has put in to try and get this thing working, because it hasn't worked. So they're just trying to get some money out of what they've put in, and they're buying something that isn't an actual system that's turning a profit and working.
Yeah.
So there's 2 different types. So that's great.
Okay. And so here's some people might refer to this as a capital stack. It's actually a balance sheet, and it's a balance sheet kind of not in the right order. So on the asset side, this is the stuff we buy when we're buying a business, where typically there's assets in the way of machinery, equipment, that kind of thing. Operating capital might take the form of receivables, inventory, and then goodwill is the difference between what you agree to pay for a business and the value of the stuff in the business. So I always use a simple example. Let's say you're buying a pizzeria and it produces $100,000 a year of profit, and you decide to buy, you and the seller agree that you're going to buy that business for $200,000. And if you add up the value of the equipment, furnishings, inventory, et cetera, in that business, it's not going to add up to the full 200 grand. It's going to be some number less than that. So your equipment, machinery, furnishings are going to be in the capital assets. The empty cardboard boxes and the bags of flour are going to be in the inventory. That's part of the operating capital. And the difference is the goodwill. And that represents the value of the people in the neighborhood knowing that they can call that pizzeria and they're going to get a tasty pizza and every Friday night. And the fact that there are fridge magnets all around town with that place's phone number on them. So that's the accounting definition of goodwill. So if this adds up in this case to 200,000, on the other side of the equation, our typical formula for buying a business is that we get some kind of long-term financing based on those capital assets. So machinery, equipment, leases, mortgages, loans, etc., against those capital assets. And then the buyer typically puts in some money. And we usually always ask the seller to finance part of the deal for several reasons. Number one, it's often hard to get a bank loan for buying a business. And we can never be certain about everything that we learn in the business buying process. And so that seller financing gives us an avenue for safety, for security, because often we have a clause in the debt instrument in the note that says this note subject to offset in the case of a material misrepresentation or an undisclosed lien or liability. And what that means is that if the seller wasn't completely honest with us beforehand when the business was being examined, we then have an avenue to kind of get recourse against that pain, whatever it might be. And so that's the value of the vendor financing. And I've seen seller financing anywhere from token amounts, 10%, to substantial amounts, 50, 60, 70%. And I've seen them over 6 months, and I've seen them over 10 years in my career. So Cool. It really is open to negotiation, whatever you think that you can put together. So this is our traditional sort of model where the buyer puts in some money, they borrow some against the assets, and the seller holds some paper. And as we move through, I'm going to show you some other ways that people do deals without using any of their own money. And I'm going to show you different variations on this same image so that you can kind of see how it compares.
Cool. Let's do that.
All right. So let me turn the screen. So how can we buy without using your cash? And here's 3 actual ways that work that I've seen done over and over and over again. So number one, the easiest thing is you just use some of your other collateral in your life in order to borrow money to come up with some of the money. And this is one of the points that I wanted to make, because when I started this presentation and I said, we're going to talk about buying a business using none of your own money, many people probably immediately assumed that it meant that you would be able to do these things if you're broke. If you have no money, that you would somehow be able to buy a business with no money. And I can tell you that that's the first little balloon I wanted to pop, is this is the most common thing that people do when they're buying a business. If they don't have enough cash for their own cash contribution, they'll often borrow against a house. Maybe they'll take a loan against a whole life insurance policy, for example, or retirement funds if they're able to. And so if we look at this example, it's identical to the first one. Instead of having our cash, it simply says your cash borrowed against other assets. Now, there's a few pros and cons to this, of course. First pro is that you preserve your cash if you have savings in the bank, for other needs or for down the road in case something happens. The cons, of course, is that you start to intermingle other assets that you have in your life with the functioning of the business. So if you remortgage your house and put the money into the business and the business fails, well, as long as you can get a job quickly enough and be able to make that mortgage payment, you're going to save the house, but you're going to end up paying off that debt. You're going to be stuck with that. So you could risk, your house, risk your retirement savings, risk the cash balance from life insurance, etc. Now, a lot of the times when you borrow money from the bank to buy a business anyway, even if it's a true commercial loan, they're going to ask you for personal guarantees anyway. So it really is hard to avoid all personal risk when you're buying a business. And this is what I've said here in the likely problems. You're going to tie up your other wealth, so it gives you less flexibility in the rest of your finances. And then the seller, of course, is anyone. Most of the deals I've worked on, people have done something like this in order to get a hefty down payment. Not many people are sitting around with $80,000, $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 simply in a savings account. Most people have it tied up in some kind of asset. So, and I didn't really put any examples here because literally I could talk about 100 different deals.
Yeah.
There was one deal though in particular where I sold a plumbing supply business, and we used a variety of different kinds of financing. We were able to get a line of credit from a bank against the inventory. We were able to get a term loan from the bank against the equipment and furnishings of the business. The seller actually held 2 notes, one with payments starting right away and a second seller note with payments starting after 5 years. And the buyer's down payment came from them refinancing the mortgage on their house. So that's just an example
of took equity out of their home?
They took some equity out, yeah.
Gotcha.
And so if you take equity out of your home, the bank will consider that equity, just like if you took money from a savings account in many circumstances.
Correct.
So let's talk about Option number 2, business expansion. So I often will find people online talking about how they bought a business using none of their own money. And what is not really ever disclosed or talked about is that they already owned a business. And the easiest way to buy a business with no money is when you already own a business, especially if you are in the same sector that the business exists in. Because what the lender is going to do, your bank, who already knows you and already knows you can execute in that business, in that industry, they're going to look at the combined entity of your existing business and the one you wish to acquire. And so if you've got paid down debts and a strong balance sheet in your business already, then oftentimes the bank is willing to really advance you everything you need. So in this case, I've just demonstrated that, again, we want to have some seller financing to protect us against unknowns. It's just a security feature that makes sense. And then we've got the bank. And so I can give you some pros and cons and some examples of this one. So the pro is it helps a business grow quickly through acquisition, buy up similar businesses in other cities, states, etc. The cons is that the existing and new businesses are now fully leveraged together often. So they then often have to go through a period of not growing to try to pay down those debts before they can pull the same trick again. And you'll hear this kind of language talked about in the world of public companies, where one will acquire another and they'll borrow heavily in order to acquire the new company. And then they'll go through a process of maybe shedding some assets to raise some money and pay off some of that debt, or they'll just devote profits to paying down their debt balances before they go off and do it again.
So option number 1 is basically a home equity line of credit and or other assets that you may have. And then option number 2 is basically a business line of credit where you sort of take equity out of your business, I guess, even if you own it completely, or you can apply for a business loan, right? And then you can go away and purchase a strategic purchase of a business that's in the same industry or niche as yours.
It's usually a combination of things when you do the business refinance, because what the bank might do is look at the tangible assets, machinery, equipment, vehicles in your business and the one you're going to buy, and say all together now, even if there's a loan on that you're paying down, all together these assets will support this much bigger loan. And then they'll look at the operating capital components like receivables, inventory, etc. And they'll say, well, based on both businesses, we can provide you with this amount of money. And then if you're a good customer and you have a good relationship with them, they may even just do some other kind of unsecured piece for a small portion of the deal. I've seen it done in a lot of different ways. I'm going to give you an example though, because I was actually a seller into one of these deals. But I want to address these problems though, because one of the problems is that you can run into issues integrating the systems and cultures between the two different businesses. So it may not be as quick and easy as you think. In the online business space that you're dealing with a lot, if you were to acquire a second online website that used entirely different systems, basically you end up duplicating all of your efforts unless you can somehow manage to port over everything onto a common platform, right? And so it can lead to problems. And the likely seller is really any business. And this is what we often call a strategic acquisition, where a business is trying to buy up other businesses that either are in the same industry or are above or below it in the value chain. So vertical integration is somehow how we refer to that. And let me give you an example of this, because back in 2007, I sold a full service junk removal business to someone else who was already in the garbage industry. And so it was a very small business. Basically, our one big asset was a truck. And then we had goodwill beyond that. And my partner and I wanted to get out. We were motivated to sell because we both wanted to move on to something else. And when we finally struck up a conversation with the garbage company, they had dumpsters and big trucks. We went and visited them at their office, and they had like $10 million worth of equipment in the yard. They were a big business. And so when they said, we'll buy your business, but we're not really interested in writing a check. If we can work out some other kind of deal, we'll do that. We were open to it because, quite frankly, we could see that they had the expertise to run a business, and we trusted them that they would be able to have the ability to pay us. And we knew that the business was good enough that if they ran it properly, our own business would provide the cash flow to make the payments to us. So what happened in that situation is we actually sold our truck to a leasing company that they used, and then they leased the truck from the leasing company, and then we accepted monthly payments until they had paid the balance of the company. So they acquired us with a combination of a lease and seller financing. And the only reason that we agreed to that was because we had confidence in them, as demonstrated by the fact that they were already in that trade. And so that's a deal that they could pull off that a stranger off the street may not have been able to. Because if some stranger came up to me and said, hey, I'll get a lease company to buy your truck and then I'll pay you the balance over the next couple of years in monthly payments, my next question would be, well, how can I know that you'll be able to run the business successfully? And this is another sort of issue that comes up when you see these ads and things online where people talk about how anyone can buy a business even with no money. The more leverage you are going to apply, the more the lenders, whether they're the seller or other parties, are going to want to know that you're capable. And so having experience, being an expert in a given trade is really critical to being able to do any kind of deal like this.
Great. Love it.
Second example here is a client of mine right now in California. He's in the janitorial space. He's already done one acquisition. His banker literally calls him asking if he's found someone else to buy because they want to give him the money. Bankers are salespeople. They get compensated on the growth of their loan portfolio. And so if you're an awesome business and you can pull this stuff off, then they're going to want to do business with you. So mostly are all seller financing, right? Here's another example. So you finance some of the assets if you can, and the seller finances the balance. So I just gave you an example with my own junk removal business of how that worked, but I'm going to give you some more. In this case, one of the big concerns is about the operating capital. So I've run across many people who have told me that they bought businesses over the years where they've just gotten financing for the hard assets and the sellers carried a note for the balance. But when I get down to the nitty gritty and start asking them questions, what I also ultimately discover is that the cash was removed from the business by the seller, and the seller collected all of the receivables, and maybe the seller gave them not quite the inventory level that they normally needed. In this case, we're talking about a business that's been robbed of its operating capital. And that makes sense because if I'm going to give you the keys to my business, Jared, and trust you with it, if I leave the inventory and receivables and cash there, what's to prevent you from simply liquidating that stuff and running away? Right? And this again gets back to the concept of trust and the risk. So a lot of the times when I meet people who've done this kind of deal, when I get down into it with them, yes, they acquired part of the business without any money, but then they needed financial resources to cover the operating capital gap. They had to have either their own money or access to credit to float receivables, to acquire more inventory, et cetera. So I put that note there. And without putting any cash into the deal, most bankers, they get a little bit nervous. Bankers like to see that you have some kind of skin in the game because they're worried that if things go poorly, you'll just run away and they'll be left holding the bag with an unpaid loan. And so you'll notice here that the lease, mortgage, and loans box is a little bit shorter than it was before because you might have to get into what we call asset-based lenders or leasing companies who are more oriented towards collateral. They are really, think of them like a pawn shop. They're interested in the value of the thing because they're calculating that they may have to come and take the thing, and they want to make sure that they're going to be able to get their money back. And so as a result, you're often not able to get as much cash out of them for the same set of collateral as you might from a banker. Let's talk about some of the pros and cons of this. So the pro is, theoretically, you don't need any of your own money. And the con is that often you have to input your own operating capital and you end up in a position of being over leveraged. What that means is you've got an awful lot of debt service payments normally. And then the question is, what happens if something goes wrong? You'll need more money. And if you don't have any money, then that can be an issue. If you are a wealthy person and you do this deal just because you don't want to apply any of your own capital and something goes wrong and you do have the ability to bring your own money to the table, well, then I guess you'll be okay. But again, I wanted to highlight how sometimes people can be, sort of led to believe that these kinds of things can be pulled off even if you're broke, and it can leave you in a very precarious situation. Some of the likely problems in an arrangement like this, usually the seller's time desperate. So most people would not agree to this kind of deal unless they really needed to sell, meaning they have some sort of pressing personal motivation that they've got to get out of it. Likely there may be issues with the business. And then I asked the question, are you buying a business or just a bunch of stuff? And I gave that example before with the ice cream shop.
That's right.
And our likely seller here, someone who's desperate, they have to get out quickly. Sometimes you'll find that they may not be as profitable as they're claiming. It could also be a family member trying to help you out. So this kind of arrangement might also happen between a parent and a child, or between two people who have a long trusted relationship, someone who knows you and trusts you implicitly with their business. And so the reason I put these 2 bullet points here is, again, these are people who would be leveraging a relationship, a trust relationship between the seller and themselves. And it's unlikely that a cold calling new person is going to be able to ring up a business owner and get them into this kind of scenario because they won't know them. So I'll give you some examples of this one. So I know a woman who used to own a beauty salon in St. John, and her husband earned much more money than she did, and he got transferred to another city. So she wanted to be with him. So she just turned to one of her trusted longtime employees and said, would you like to own the shop? And just agreed to finance it for her, right? Yep. Because she wanted to move. She didn't want to stick around and wait around trying to find a buyer that had cash or anything like that. She wanted a deal done right away. And she knew that her longtime employee had the skills to run the business successfully. I spoke once with a guy down in Texas who was offered a delivery business, and it was because the owner was headed to prison and basically had to make a deal to sell the business, or else the whole thing would fall apart in his absence. I know a woman here in town where I live who was friends with another woman, and the woman's sister died. And so the lady that I know had an opportunity to make a business, to make an offer to buy the aesthetics business entirely on a note, because without somebody running the business, it would have fallen apart. And the brother and sister that were the heirs of the estate didn't have the inclination or the skills or the desire to run the business. So it just happened to be right person at the right time. An opportunity was presented, and she said, I'll take it off your hands. I'll pay you whatever you think it's worth, but I have to pay you with a monthly payment over time. And so that deal was done. Trucking company in Alberta. This is an example of a trusted relationship. A fellow started working for a trucking company, worked over the course of many years, eventually worked himself up to a management role. When the seller wanted to retire, he knew that the trusted manager had the ability to run the business. The two of them went to the bank together. The bank looked at what was in the business, gave them the biggest loan they could, and that money was used to pay a dividend to the owner. So after that happened, the equity of the business was worth at its lowest point, because now the business has this big loan within it. And the seller then sold those shares to his manager and financed the whole transaction, leaving the manager with this big debt within the business and owing the seller money for the shares over time. So again, fully financed, but only because long-time relationship between the buyer and seller, two men who trusted each other very much, and the seller wanted to create that opportunity for the person who ultimately was the buyer. So those are the examples. I've got some takeaways here itemized on the sheet. Did you have any questions, Jared?
Well, I just want to say, option number 3, mostly or all seller financing, it's basically a lot of luck in that option. And then I guess when we look at option number 1 and option number 2, you kind of need to have one or the other, or both combined. You need to have some assets in terms of, a house or a business, and you need to have some things that you can put up for collateral. If you have some of those things, you can do that. But if somebody that doesn't have a home, a business, life insurance, retirement fund and things they can use as collateral, basically like what you're saying is it's almost impossible for somebody to buy a business with no money. if they actually have no wealth.
Well,
if they're starting from scratch, which makes sense. Because why would anybody lend against that unless there is option number 3, that level of trust and relationship?
Yeah. And so there's a few twists on this though. So let me go to the takeaways because I want to put some other sort of balloons up in the air too. So just as you said, no money deals are normally done by people who already have some degree of wealth. It's nearly impossible to execute unless you have a relationship you can leverage or are very lucky. It's like the lady who knew the person who passed away.
Yeah.
Luck is not a plan, right? If you want to buy a business one day, my biggest advice to most people is to fix your financial life and accumulate some wealth. The reason why bankers love to see people who have savings is because it indicates that you know how to run a household profitably. If you can keep your expenses lower than your income in your house, that's called savings. That's actually household profit, right? Because you've managed to accumulate some money. There's no magic formulas for this. Back on my bookshelf over there, I've got some books written in the 1970s that will talk about things that people did back in that era before the Texas savings and loans scandal, before, all sorts of different things happened throughout the world. At one time you could buy a business and get a percentage of its appraised value versus what you paid. Well, you can't do that anymore. If you're going to buy a business, the banker wants to know what you're paying for the business, right? And so there's all kinds of old school tricks that people still float out there as methods to buy a business with no money that just don't work anymore. I call it a unicorn hunt, because if you go online and you start looking at some of the stuff that's out there, you will find examples of people who will claim to have done a deal or something where they pulled this off. And the fact of the matter is that maybe they did, but are you going to be able to reliably implement a plan or a program in order to replicate those results? I've had face-to-face conversations with people who have been lured in by some of these buy a business for no money.
It's just deals. Such a shame, isn't it, that there's that many people out there, David, that's where their content is they're selling people a lie. And it's a shame that people have been lured in, bought their course and expected to, there's unicorns are everywhere.
Well, one of these guys actually told me that he was instructed that he would have to contact at least 10,000 businesses.
Wow.
To find one.
Wow.
Right? And one of the things that I would say is that if you find someone online who's talking about information, if I go looking, how do I change the oil in my car? Right? I'm going to find some guy with a video and he's going to be changing the oil in his car, right? He's like answering the question. Mm-hmm. But if somebody's talking about something like buying a business, but all they ever talk about is how you're going to be wealthy and how it's going to fix your money problems and how, anyone can do it, even if you're broke, and this is your path to riches. What they're not actually talking about anything to do with deals. They're inflating an aspirational desire and sort of poking your pain points, which maybe is that you're having money troubles or something or other. And, that falls into a completely different category, which is like the get rich quick category, right? And it's funny because the people that eventually I meet, because I've got a YouTube channel with tons of videos about buying and selling businesses, they'll take one of these programs and then they'll go out in the world and they'll find a deal and they'll make an offer, and then they'll try to execute what they were taught is a way to finance it using like asset-based lenders or something like this. And they'll go out and start talking to these finance companies who will start going through their process. And when they find out the person has no money of their own, one door closes after another. And then they go looking online, they'll find me and they'll say, how do I put this deal together? The guy I took the course from won't return my messages anymore. And I'll look at the deal. I think we must be
talking about the same person here.
I'm like, it's just not going to be. No, you know what? There's a dozen of them, Jared.
Yeah.
And this is why I don't like to say names, because there are new ones all the time that are sort of promising these things. And then there's the investor angle, the last bullet point there on the screen. Finding investors to put money in to buy a business. It can be done. I mean, you can be a guy who's broke and you can convince other people to give you money to buy a business. The problem with that is that they have to have belief in you. They have to believe that you are absolutely capable of executing. And then there's another problem too, because if you're going to use the bank as well, when a bank finds out there are investors, the bank often wants those people to be guarantors on the loan as well. So you're not just asking these investors to put in some money, which they might lose. You're asking them to put in some money and often a guarantee. And that is very difficult.
And they're not just really investing in the business. They're investing in you. And you kind of need to have some sort of case studies and some sort of reputation or proof that you've done this before. Maybe you had 5 businesses and, a couple of them went bankrupt, and 1 or 2 went really well, and then you sold them and you put that money into other investments and you want to go away and buy something with investors. An investor is going to trust somebody like that, right? Who's built up some good businesses and has some experience and can prove that. But somebody who's just like, hey, I just bought a course on how to buy a business. I mean, it's going to be hard to raise that type of funds.
The classic example for this would be someone who's had success in business and has ended up with no money because some kind of thing like a divorce or a health issue, maybe made them laid up ill for a couple of years, or they got a divorce, which cost them a lot of money. And so people can see their history of business success, and the reason why they're broke is easily explained. And people can get their head around that, right? And often somebody who's had a great deal of success in business over the course of time, they're plugged into a network of other people who have wealth. And so those are the people they're going to go talk to, the people that they chum around with. It's funny because when I talk with people who want to buy a business, and they'll say, how do people come across these deals? 80% of businesses that are sold, by the way, don't go through a broker. It's a private deal. Buyers and sellers meet each other. And I know it's likely very different, with the online businesses out there, because it's more of a global marketplace. But people will say, how do people find out about these? And I'll say, well, their business owners hang out with other business owners, and they do that at places like the Rotary Club or the Kiwanis Club, or through maybe a church entrepreneur group or something like this. And so they've got this social network where they're hanging out with other people with similar interests who are doing similar things. And when one of those people want to exit, they're thinking, do I know someone perhaps who could be a buyer? And they're making these deals amongst themselves. And so at the very least, if this is something you would plan to do one day, you got to start thinking about who you're spending your time with. And it may require you to consciously make an upgrade of who is in your local network and who you're spending time with.
Love it. I love it. Thanks so much, David. That's great.
No problem. On this next slide, I just put a couple of points. I just said, if you do manage to pull off a deal, you then face what I call the day 2 problem. And sometimes, Jared, people are so focused on getting a deal done that, I've heard stories of people who will borrow against credit cards and commit, the receipts of the business in a cash advance kind of scenario. And they'll do everything they can to bring the money together on closing day. And then the next day they have to operate the business with all of those debt expenses and all those problems. And if any kind of hiccup occurs, then they're sunk. The reason why we buy a business instead of starting one is to reduce risk, so that we get the customers and the processes and the profits in place up front. And so the way that you buy it, you want to make sure you're not reintroducing the risk. You want to make sure that it makes sense by doing some kind of forward-looking cash flow forecast that can demonstrate that if there's some kind of bump or a hazard, that you're going to end up being okay.
I've had somebody buy a business before and be like, oh my God, I just bought a business, and they're like, oh, I don't know if I want to own, I don't know if I want to be a business owner. But they had this belief system until they bought a business, everything would be, once they bought the business, everything would be good. And they didn't realize, there's a few things to do here to run a business, and they didn't want the stress. Bought it with his own money. So didn't have the anxiety of having to pay back money. But when you are fully leveraged, is you're operating from a place of stress. And I don't think that's the way that we should go. Like when we come into this venture, our goal, I believe everybody's goal is, or at least it should be, is to have a better lifestyle and to have a better life. Now, when you go away and buy a business with 100% finance and you don't know how to run that business, or you haven't had that business looked at by a professional professional prior to purchasing it throughout due diligence, then what you do is you just add a whole lot more risk and a whole lot more stress. And you, instead of making your life better, you make your life worse. And because you try to jump 1,000 steps ahead rather than slowly work out how to build up your finances, your savings, and how to run a household, like you said, like a business, to be able to then prove to yourself that I know I can do this in this portion of my life. Let's try the next step.
Yeah. People get into this because they want to level up. They want to improve their life in some way, either because they want to get out of a corporate work environment, or they want to earn more money, or maybe they're in a new country where their work credentials aren't recognized, and so they're barred from practicing a profession, for example, and they need to get a higher income. There's all kinds of reasons why people want to buy a business, but it always has to lead to a better place. And it's sad sometimes when I meet people who've done a bad deal. They paid too much for the business, and the easiest way to borrow too much to buy a business is to pay too much in the first place, right? And then they find that in order to make things work, they end up having to work the 80 hours a week or whatnot. And it basically, what happens is you end up indenturing yourself to the seller, because you take part of your future life and you take that value and you give it to the seller. And the difference between, some guy in Ireland during the potato famine who agreed to work 2 years in the New World on a farm in order to trade for a ticket across the ocean, that person knew exactly what they were in for. They understood precisely what they were trading. A lot of the times when people get into a bad business deal, they don't know what they're doing, and they only find out later that they've made the mistake. And unfortunately, there can be a lot of resentment, a lot of anger. I've seen people who've been stuck in a business that they paid too much for, where they've got these huge debts, and they can't resell the business for what they paid. And so they end up stuck there until they've whittled down those debts to the point where they can eventually find an exit.
In a second, I'm going to show you where to stalk David, but let me ask you, have you learned any other ways you can buy a business with no money? Please put that in the comments below if you have.
Cool. Thanks so much. That was awesome.
Yeah, no problem.
As you can tell, David knows his stuff. And if you aren't already, head to David's YouTube channel and hit subscribe and follow him. I'll put a link in the description.
And I've got a bunch of books you can find on Amazon. And if you're in some place like Australia where the shipping cost is really expensive, you can find these books on Kindle and audio as well.
YouTube watcher, what's up? It's Jared Krause here. And if you've watched this video up until now, please smash the like button. I'm glad you're liking the video. Also, thank you so much for following, and I hope you are doing super good. I also want to ask you, please consider subscribing, because my commitment and exploration on YouTube is about to explode. I'm talking stories, polls, more amazing content, more supplies and delight, more collaborations like this. So please at least consider it, and I hope to see you in the next video.
Hey YouTube watcher, if you thought that video was good, you should check out this video here on the 2 best types of websites beginners should buy. Or check out my playlist on how I made my first 100K from buying websites and how to do due diligence. Check it out. It's an awesome playlist. You'll enjoy it.